Thank you. Thank you, Chip, for that lovely introduction and for inviting me here to Sydney. I'm very happy to have had an excuse to be here. I should say thank you to the entire staff of the Sydney Writers' Festival and to the fabulous volunteers, and now to you who have stuck it out to the bitter end. 100 years ago, there was a young man named Robert Carlton Brown trying to make a living in New York City by writing for newspapers and magazines, prose and poetry, whatever they'd take. He published his first book in 1913, a pulp novel titled What Happened to Mary, cobbled together from a bunch of stories he'd written for the Ladies' World. And Brown has faded into obscurity. You can't even find him in Wikipedia, which these days is saying something. However, Wikipedia does have an entry for What Happened to Mary, not the book, but a movie made by Thomas Edison's Kinetoscope Company, the first motion picture serial ever made, 12 one-reel episodes. And this new technology made a deep impression on Brown. In the 30s, he turned up in Paris, now calling himself just Bob Brown, writing more poetry and hanging out with other literary expats like Paul Bowles and Gertrude Stein, and generally being a modernist with a capital M. And around this time, Bob decided that the book was dead and that he should make an announcement. He wrote a manifesto, manifestos being, big things with the modernists, declaring, books are antiquated word containers. Modern word conveyors are needed now. Reading will have to be done by machine. Machines were exciting. Suddenly there were automobiles and radios and airplanes. Art and music were embracing the future. But Bob said, only the reading half of literature lags behind, stays old-fashioned, frumpish, beskirted. Though we have advanced from Gutenberg's movable type through to linotype to photo composing, we still consult the book in its original archaic form as the only oracular means we know for carrying the word mystically to the eye. Writing has been bottled up in books since the start. It is time to pull out the stopper. So Bob invented a machine. He described it as a lightweight, simple apparatus that one could attach to an electrical outlet and read novels of 100,000 words in 10 minutes. He was thinking about the movie business, which had recently come up with talkies, so he named his machine Readies. He explained, the printing was done microscopically by a new photographic process on a transparent roll, able to carry the contents of a book on something as small as a typewriter ribbon. Now, even though he's using the past tense, I think you can tell that this machine never really existed, except in Bob world. Still, he hit up his writer friends for contributions and actually published a book titled Readies for Bob Brown's Machine, with pieces from Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, and Nancy Cunard, and a bunch of others. And as of last week, there was a shop in New York that had a copy that you could buy via Amazon for $2,875. American dollars, so cheap. Speaking to us from the century past, Bob Brown begs us to wave books a fond farewell. I request the reader to fix his mental eye for a moment on the ever-present future. I ask him to forget for the moment the existing medievalism of the book. God bless it, it's staggering on its last leg and about to fall. Well, 80 years ago, you had to be pretty far out there to prophesy the death of the book. But nowadays, everybody's doing it. It seems you can't walk 10 steps out your front door before some stranger grabs you by the lapels and puts gin-soaked lips to your ear and whispers something like, forget paper. Here come e-books. The physical object consisting of bound dead trees in shiny wrapper is headed for the antique heap. Books are goners. Actually, that's a quote from Newsweek, New Year's Day 2000. Nicholas Negroponte, former director of MIT's Media Lab, has been saying the same thing for years. In 1996, he predicted that the art of bookmaking would be as relevant in 2020 as blacksmithing. And he said it again last fall. Paper books are really dead, they're gone. His argument is about technological efficiency, framed in terms of bits. He reckons that a typical book weighs a pound or more, fills 100 cubic inches, costs $20, contains a paltry 5 million bits. And of course, that many bits on a chip is a speck of dust. Beamed to us at light speed from the cloud, weightless. Now here's an older version of approximately the same dream. It's one of a series of cigarette cards created by a French commercial artist named Jean-Marc Coté in 1899. And it depicts life in the year 2000 as imagined a century before. Here's a classroom. You can see that a boy is turning the crank on a sort of grinding machine while the teacher feeds in an armful of books, their contents to be conveyed somehow by wire into the students' ears. When the editor of Slate, the online magazine, Jacob Weisberg, got his first Kindle 2 years ago, or rather, he said, his cool new literature delivery system, he made this pronouncement. After a happy 550-year union, reading and printing are getting separated. Printed books, the most important artifacts of human civilization, are going to join newspapers and magazines on the road to obsolescence. In fact, Amazon.com has just this week announced that they've reached the milestone of selling more Kindle editions than printed books, which they now call print books. And their announcement struck me as annoyingly gleeful. So apparently, this last week, we've all been partying before the apocalypse. We're in a collective state of, well, let's just say that the state we're in has a name, and it isn't New South Wales. All around us, the great bookstore chains are going bust. A gloomy fog hangs over the publishing industry. We're put on notice that long-form authors, and by the way, just that expression, long form, makes me shudder. Authors are now doomed to go the way of the dinosaur, while all around the new furry mammals rise up, the bloggers and texters and Twitterers who shall in due course inherit the earth. Thanks for everything, Gutenberg, and now may you rest in peace. Well, obviously, this isn't how I see it. On the contrary, I think we've reached a shining moment for this ancient form. And there are a bunch of different arguments all getting tangled together here, so let me try to unravel a couple of them. First of all, there's the question of what we're talking about when we say book. There's the physical object. This is the one also known as tree flakes encased in dead cow. The pages could be blank, for all we know, but we still call it a book. And then on the other hand, there's what these days is called content, the stuff the writer writes. That's a book before it ever gets to the printer. But there's something not entirely satisfying about the distinction between content and container. Somehow, words in a book is not as simple as wine in bottles. Ted Nelson, the computer scientist who invented the idea of hypertext, used to say that paper is just an object that some information has been sprayed onto. But when we read a book, Are we just sucking the information back off the paper? It feels more interesting than that. We surely interact with a book in a more complex way than we do with a wine bottle. I think this is what I.A. Richards was getting at in 1924 when he began his Principles of Literary Criticism by comparing the book to a machine. He said, a book is a machine to think with. What kind of a machine? Not a bellows or a locomotive, he suggested, but more like a loom on which to reweave some raveled parts of our civilization. Now, clearly, he's not thinking about leather and paper. Nowadays, it's a lot easier to identify books with machines. The Kindle is definitely a machine. So is an e-book a book? You could argue it both ways. For example, a chocolate bunny is certainly not a bunny. If you choose, you can define a book as a bunch of pages sewn together along one edge and exclude all these e-things that I can store 1 million of at one time on my iPhone. But I think we better choose the other way. An electric guitar is definitely a guitar. And even though electric guitars are much more efficient generators of sound, acoustic guitars aren't on anyone's endangered list. In fact, we love acoustic guitars. The expression acoustic guitar, by the way, is a retronym like film camera, cloth diaper, George H.W. Bush. And now printed books, or dead tree books, or physical books, or just, cover your ears, non-electronic books. But like acoustic guitars, dead tree books inspire nostalgia, which is maybe a slightly disreputable emotion. So do vinyl phonograph records inspire nostalgia. There are plenty of people who believe fervently that no digital medium for reproducing music will ever sound as sweet or as true as an old vinyl record. And personally, I think those people are nuts. But I confess to similar feelings about a finely bound, decal-edge, hardcover book. I like the way it feels in my hands. There's a word for this particular species of nostalgia. I think it was coined by Ben Ehrenreich in the Los Angeles Review of Books. He calls it biblionecrophilia. The retreat of the print faithful into a sort of autistic fetishization of the book as object. I'm pretty sure he means that pejoratively. He mentions the soft, woody aroma of a yellow-paged Grove Press paperback. And those adjectives are okay, soft and woody. But there are a lot of fine descriptive writers in this room who could do better. A team in London studied the smell of old books and came up with a combination of grassy notes with a tang of acids and a hint of vanilla over an underlying mustiness. These fine wordsmiths are chemists, and that's the official peer-reviewed description of old book smell as reported in the Journal of Analytical Chemistry. It must mean something that more people are talking about the smell of books these days than ever before in literary history. Is this an indicator of love or of fear? There's an actual website called smellofbooks.com. I'm not making this stuff up. A performance artist named Rachel Morrison has a project underway now in the library of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where she's pulling books off the shelves one by one, sniffing them, and then writing down a description, an exact description of the odor in an accounting ledger. That's her with her eyes closed, reading a book with her nose. She says she's motivated by thinking about a future where people might think it's strange or gross that books once had a smell. And what a strange obsession that is. You're never going to hear anybody say, oh, that David Mitchell, that Taya Obrate, I just love the way their books smell. You can't smell the words. I suggest that we just bid this issue a fond farewell and agree that books are books, electronic or not. As a technological object, the book was frozen in form for half a millennium, and for a good reason. At the risk of being a biblionecrophiliac again, let me say that a dead tree book, is an example of peak technology, a tool ideally suited to its task. The book is like a hammer. Hammers can be tweaked and varied, but it will never go obsolete. Even when builders pound nails by the thousand with pneumatic nail guns, every household needs a hammer. Likewise, the bicycle is alive and well. It was invented in a world without automobiles, and for speed and range, it has been surpassed by motorcycles and all kinds of scooters. But there's nothing quaint about bicycles. They outsell cars. The e-book, all weightless and digital, where the old thing was bulky and tactile, but books, either way, have always embodied technology. It's just that the technology is getting an update. The scroll was a fine technology in its day, and no doubt some people were sad and nostalgic when it was updated with the codex, a terrifically efficient idea, leaves arranged in quires, multiple pages bound together along one edge, handy for carrying. I'm sure plenty of people complained that the codex was a random access device. Okay, they didn't use those exact words. Where the scroll is sequential access, and surely the latter makes more sense for books, which you're meant to read straight through. But the codex was so much handier. By the 8th century or so, if you were an author and your stuff was only available in scrolls, you were done for. Then technology marched onward with the printing press and movable type, and these inventions didn't change the form of the book the way the codex did. The printing press really was a duplicating machine. It made books stable and trustworthy. It's hard to overestimate the psychological importance of knowing that everyone else's copy of a book is the same. But people started grumbling because, of course, what the printing press also did was start a flood. Already in 1680, Gottfried Leibniz complained that the horrible mass of books keeps on growing. In the end, the disorder will become nearly insurmountable. Alexander Pope said, "Providence permitted the invention of printing as a scourge for the sins of the learned, and paper became so cheap and printers so numerous that a deluge of authors covered the land." Well, admittedly, Pope was being satirical. Now we have numerous printers, cheap paper, even cheaper internet access, a definite deluge of authors, and the book at death's door. In the US, just this week, Bowker has released its yearly count of new titles. It reports that in 2010, traditional publishers released 316,000 new titles and editions. That's up 5% from 2009. That was up 4% from 2008, and so on. It goes up every year. And the reason I emphasize traditional publishers is that Bowker also reports on what they call the non-traditional sector, which means self-published books, print-on-demand books, and micro-niche books, whatever that means. In 2009, there were more than 1 million different titles in the non-traditional category, and in 2010, the number is more than twice that, 2.7 million. The buzzword for the non-traditional publisher's business model is internet-driven. These are physical books, but they wouldn't exist without cyberspace. So if you're a reader, you might be forgiven for thinking that the problem is too many books. Then you would find yourself agreeing with Thomas de Quincey. Under our present enormous accumulation of books, I do affirm that a miserable distraction of choice must be very generally incident to the times, that the symptoms of it are in fact very prevalent, and that one of the chief symptoms is an enormous gluttonism for books and for adding language to language. And in this way, literature becomes much more a source of torment than of pleasure. Distraction of choice is a nice phrase, I think. Too many books, not enough time. When people say they're worried about the death of the book, I think it's clear what they really mean. They're worried about the death of the reader. No, not even death, just waning attention span. And it's true, some people are too busy keeping up with their Facebook friends or playing video games to read books anymore. I just don't see this as a problem. Some people used to be too busy watching television, and before that maybe they were too busy playing sports or tilling the field. 20 years ago, the great New York Times columnist Russell Baker was sitting down to watch a baseball game on TV, and on the pregame show they had a writer named Jane Levy promoting a new novel about a girl who grows up to be a sports writer. And apparently the interviewer was very nice, but at one point he hefted the book and said, "Whoa, 300 pages. That's a lot, Jane. Aren't you worried that no one has time these days to read 300 pages? Russell Baker said he wanted to shout at his TV set. "Great Moloch and little fishes, man," I wanted to shout. Aren't you ashamed to ask a question like that in front of a huge audience that's about to spend 3 hours watching a televised baseball game? We, you here in this room, are readers, and you are the exceptions. Most people have always been too busy for books, and still, here we are. Lately, this conversation has seemed to be all about the internet and digital media, but it actually considerably predates that. Marshall McLuhan began talking about the electric age in the 50s and 60s, and the most electric thing he had was a fuzzy black and white TV. And that was enough. It put books into a new sort of perspective for him. He was happy to begin prophesying the death of print culture. He argued that the electric age would bring a return to the bygone epoch of orality, the tribal echo land. And for McLuhan, this would be a return to Eden. By their dependence on the spoken word for information, people were drawn together into a tribal mesh. The spoken word is more emotionally laden than the written. Audile, tactile, tribal man partook of the collective unconscious, lived in a magical, integral world patterned by myth and ritual, its values divine. For McLuhan, the written word was regimented and specialist. The spoken word is creative and participational. The alphabet is a technology of visual fragmentation and specialism that leads to a desert of classified data. McLuhan said that when literate people considered this issue, they get into a sort of moral panic. One way of framing this censure of print would be to say it offers only a narrow channel of communication. The channel is linear and even fragmented, whereas speech, in the primal case, face-to-face human intercourse alive with gesture and touch, engages all the senses, not just hearing. If the ideal of communication is a meeting of souls, then writing is a sad shadow of the ideal. McLuhan would say that people sniffing books are desperate for synesthesia and tactility. They want a richer sensory experience than print is capable of providing. We book people are what he called typographic man. And he didn't mean this as a compliment. So for McLuhan, the electronic era promises a new epoch of the spoken word, only this time the conversation promises to be global. The computer barely existed before McLuhan was embracing it. Today, he wrote, this was 1964, today computers hold out the promise of a means of instant translation of any code or language into any other code or language. The computer, in short, promises by technology a Pentecostal condition of universal understanding and unity. The condition of weightlessness. People in 1964 were talking about weightlessness a lot because the first astronauts were being shot into space. McLuhan says the condition of weightlessness may be paralleled by the condition of speechlessness that could confer a perpetuity of collective harmony and peace. Well, many of McLuhan's predictions were eerily good, but that one's kind of a dud, isn't it? Speechlessness, collective harmony and peace. He doesn't seem to have anticipated Twitter. But it was all, in its time, very influential. Within a few years, Jacques Derrida was becoming famous for complaining about writing being encased in a book. He said the form of the book was now going through a period of general upheaval. This is 1967, mind you, and appears less natural than ever. The idea of the book, which always refers to a natural totality, is profoundly alien to the sense of writing. It is the encyclopedic protection of theology and of logocentrism against the disruption of writing, against its aphoristic energy. I think it's fair to point out that all these theorists forecasting the death of books did their forecasting in books. That may sound like a cheap shot, but I don't think it is. I firmly believe that the book form is essential to the type of extended, persuasive, reasoned discourse in which they were engaging, and that the many and varied theorists foretelling the death of books are carefully oblivious to the irony. Bob Brown, by the way, traveled around some more, eventually returned to the U.S., where he ran a bookstore in Greenwich Village called Bob Brown's Books. And he kept writing, and he published his last book in 1959, titled The Complete Book of Cheese. I own a copy. It's about cheese. Before he went straight, though, part of Bob's theorizing involved an idea that it didn't make sense for your eye to have to zigzag across the page and down the page. He thought words should just be streamed across your field of vision. Robert Coover, discovering the personal computer in 1992, had an even more radical idea. He decided it was time to move beyond what he called that compulsory author-directed movement from the beginning of a sentence to its period, from the top of the page to the bottom, from the first page to the last. In other words, books are too linear. Enough with beginning, middle, end. The computer brings freedom in the form of hypertext, that is, in the form of links or branches, creating multi-dimensional spaces. Hypertext was a 1963 invention of Ted Nelson, a slightly mad computer scientist whose vision underpins the World Wide Web, even though to this day he considers that a terrible bastardization of his original brilliant idea. This is Ted Nelson's sketch of his idea. That's meant to be a hypertext document of parallel pages. It is unbound, in contrast to a book. The lines are meant to represent what we might call links, but he prefers to call visible beams of transclusion. And he explains all that in a book, of course. When Robert Coover picked up the banner of hypertext in 1992, he described it as writing done in the nonlinear or non-sequential space made possible by the computer. This was in an essay in the New York Times Book Review with a dramatic title. Can you guess? The End of Books, and not even a question mark. It was another manifesto. Coover declared, "Fluidity, contingency, indeterminacy, plurality, discontinuity are the hypertext buzzwords of the day, and they seem to be fast becoming principles, in the same way that relativity not so long ago displaced the falling apple." As opposed to fixed unidirectional page turning, hypertext presents a radically divergent technology, interactive and polyvocal, favoring a plurality of discourses over definitive utterance and freeing the reader from domination by what used to be called the author. Coover, an author, admitted that he was an example of that, and that he was not an expert navigator of hyperspace, and that being 60 years old, he felt he was unlikely to engage in any major hypertext fictions of his own. But so he started teaching a course, the Brown University Hypertext Fiction Workshop, and he became a huge booster. Part of the pitch involved empowering the reader. Hypertext would free the reader to organize her own texts. Text becomes unstable. It loses its canonical certainty. And all of this is good. Well, now we're coming up on 20 years since Coover's version of the end of books. And where literature is concerned, I'm going to go out on a limb and pronounce the end of hypertext. Not only has the great hypertext fiction failed to materialize, so has the mediocre hypertext fiction. It turned out that 1992 was the last year for the Brown University Hypertext Workshop. Just 8 years later, in 2000, Coover himself turned about face. By then, the internet was at full boil, and Coover wasn't thrilled with what he saw. In terms of new serious literature, the web has not been very hospitable. It tends to be a noisy, restless, opportunistic, superficial, e-commerce-driven, chaotic realm dominated by hacks, pitchmen, and pretenders, in which the quiet voice of literature cannot easily be heard, or, if heard by chance, attended to for more than a moment or two. Which is true. Personally, I'm a more or less happy citizen of cyberspace. I'm not much for Facebook, but sometimes I do Twitter. I admit my tweets are not serving the cause of literature. They're not even serving the cause of my next book. Literature is shapely and meditative. Cyberspace is formless and noisy. Literature is slow. Cyberspace operates at light speed. Books stand alone. Cyberspace is all about the connectedness. Cyberspace is hyperspace, where information is concerned. Still, my sympathies are with Robert Coover, the year 2000 version, after his infatuation with hypertext faded. So let me get out the crystal ball. Here's what's going to happen henceforth. Books will survive. I promise. You can take it to the bank. Books have a strange quality. Now I'm quoting the Scottish poet William Drummond 400 years ago. Books have that strange quality that being of the frailest and tenderest matter, they outlast brass, iron, and marble. Of course, when he said the frailest and tenderest matter, he was talking about paper. Now it's electrons. That's fine too. Some kinds of books will not survive. In the future, dictionaries will not be printed on paper. We can suddenly see that the codex was never the appropriate technology for looking up the meanings or the pronunciations or the histories of words. Or rather, it was an okay technology for 400 years, and now it has been superseded. The greatest of all dictionaries, the OED, was quick to figure this out. They haven't said so officially, but I think it's safe to bet that there will never again be a dead tree version of the OED, which is already a great enterprise of cyberspace. Likewise, encyclopedias, whatever you think of Wikipedia, it's already 100 times broader and significantly deeper than the Britannica ever was. It serves virtually every language of the world. It's not perfectly reliable. Sometimes it's amateurish. Sometimes it's just plain wrong. And I think not the least of its contributions is to remind us that the best printed encyclopedias were also sometimes amateurish and sometimes wrong. Likewise, telephone books. Does anyone miss them? The demise of telephone books should make significant contribution to the Earth's reforestation. But despite the exceptions, dead tree books are going to survive. Where they're most vulnerable, it's because they're made poorly. Cheap paper, shoddy bindings, design that says, I'm made to be tossed into the trash bin when you're done. Where the physical book is concerned, publishers need to cater to the human instinct to collect things of value, which is a powerful instinct. Physical books should be expressions of design and desire. The kind of person who wants to put her nose in a book should be able to do that. She's not going away. Maybe books of paper will be expensive. Maybe their appeal will be retro and vintage, like violins of maple and spruce. That's not a fate worse than death. Right now, it seems to me that plenty of books are more beautiful than ever. The art of jacket design keeps reaching new imaginative heights. And if there's something ironic about that, I can't explain it. Speaking of publishers, I would like to promise that they're going to survive too. But actually, I have no idea. In the new electronic landscape, they're facing serious threats from Amazon on down. But I think some publishers are acting like their own worst enemies these days. Their self-destructive behavior includes treating books as commodities, chasing after blockbusters, caring more for celebrities than actual authors, and otherwise selling themselves short. I believe that the publishers who triumph will be the ones who regain confidence in their traditional virtues, and I mean especially the art of editing. There are authors who think they'd be happy to dispense with the middleman and go it alone, but I am emphatically not one of them. A publisher that values books as books, that will edit me with care and help my book find an audience, my friend for life. But I'm even more worried about booksellers, the lonely forts, as John Updike put it shortly before he died, spilling light onto the sidewalk. Real-world booksellers, and especially independents, play a crucial part in the literary ecosystem that I don't see Amazon or other online booksellers duplicating. I think it's possible that bookstores will find a path to surviving in a world where most books are digital. Stores can sell those locally and personally. I hope that they will. But ebooks shouldn't be a threat to publishers. Consider ebooks as a gift. They're an opportunity. They need to be made much, much better. My personal experience with reading books on my little devices has been only 6 months, so your mileage may vary, but it seems to me that some traditional publishers are putting out ebooks with little attention to typography or design, ebooks that look kind of amateurish, poorly proofread. Hyphenation is inconsistent. Pages have widows and orphans. Footnotes don't work properly. It's no good for a publisher to think of ebooks as a chance to make some extra money on the quick. I think they're charging readers too much, they're paying authors too little, and they're not treating the object, such as it is, with much respect. They don't yet think that the experience of ebooks should be beautiful. I'm hopeful that that's temporary. Meanwhile, it's creating an opportunity that's being filled by specialty houses devoted entirely to ebooks. Now there we get into dangerous territory, because when you really go to work on making good ebooks, you can do some things that can't be done in print at all. You can enhance the ebooks, to use the current jargon. One of my old books has just been released as an enhanced ebook version by one of these creative specialty firms. And what this means is that where the original book used some photographs and some line drawings to illustrate some of the tricky bits of science, in the ebook we can convey extra dimensions and move in time with videos and applets. And I'm happy with these. Books, after all, have contained pictures along with words from the earliest times. But there are plenty of other possibilities too, and they make me a little queasy. I don't want hyperlinks in my books or in the books I'm reading. I don't want social bookmarking. And I don't want opportunities for online dating or any other form of multitasking. I don't need a chance to create avatars for my favorite characters. I don't want anything, that is, to take me out of the book. And the book is not a multimedia spectacle with subtitles. Even worse, there's an idea going around that when all books are together online, when Google or anyone else manages to create that ultimate digital universal library, when all the books are equally present and available, then they will in effect become one great book, searchable in the cloud. Some people are looking for clever ways to encourage this. They talk about mashups, where the creative user can mix and mingle fragments from books at will. They encourage user interfaces that allow annotations by the reader, not just in their private margins, but for collective sharing. No book is an island. Books are cross-linked, read in snippets and reassembled. It's hypertext again, writ large in the hyperspace that's already so much a part of our lives. Barriers between books disappear, and so does the idea of authorship. Books are to be liquefied, seep out of their bindings. There are smart and famous people who talk as though this is a good thing. I think they couldn't be more wrong about what books are and what they are destined to become. The fact is, in terms of information storage, a book is a narrow communications channel. It's a stream of abstract words arranged in linear order. McLuhan was right about this. It is restricted. It employs only one of our senses. It employs that sense in the most limited way, literally one-dimensional, as Bob Brown recognized. And it does that in ebooks just as much as in printed books. And every book is an island. As much as it may echo or reference or steal from its predecessors, the individual book lives and dies on its own. It is not part of a teeming, infinite word stream to be searched and sampled promiscuously. That's my idea of a nightmare. Nicholson Baker, the novelist and nostalgic admirer of old paper media, reluctantly tried out the Kindle not long ago for an essay in The New Yorker. And he devoted plenty of time to making fun of the object. The greenish, sickly gray screen, the 5-way clicker switch, and so forth. He says it's like a white 1982 Impala with blown shocks. But then he forces himself to read some thriller or other. At that point, I was locked into the plot and it didn't matter. Poof, the Kindle disappeared just as Jeff Bezos had promised it would. I began walking up and down the driveway, reading in the sun. 3 distant lawnmowers were going. Someone wearing a salmon-colored shirt was spraying a hose across the street. But I was in the courtroom listening to the murderer testify. I felt the primitive clawing pressure of wanting to know how things turned out. The e-book disappears. The dead tree book always disappeared, too. You can enjoy the smell of leather as you pull it from the shelf, but once you're reading, it's gone. Smell, leather, everything. Even the stream of characters past the eye is somehow not visible. We don't see letters. We don't even see words. Or we hear the words as well as we see them. We feel their rhythms and their tones, which is to say their music. And then we're jacked in to a virtual world, which is somehow every bit as vivid, every bit as commanding as the real one. That's what the author wants. The book melts away. John Donne preached, "He that desires to print a book should much more desire to be a book." Our very lives are books, he meant, for others to read. The book is the message, not the medium. It's a long message. The message is organized in one mind and then goes out to others. That's the book. That will endure. We're arriving in an informational universe of many channels, of which books will remain only one. Different channels have different qualities. One is their time horizon. If your information comes in the form of video, history seems to begin sometime in the early 20th century. The time horizon of video can be pushed back a little further into the past with the help of photographs and visual tricks. That's That's what the documentary filmmaker Ken Burns did so cleverly with the American Civil War and the story of jazz, pushed back the time horizon. The internet tends to present a view of history that begins barely 20 years ago. Facebook and Twitter have time horizons so foreshortened that there's no history at all. Only books in their disconnected, frozen, linear physical form manage to break through the technological barriers to the past. The books of the world have a time horizon too, and it's virtually the beginning of human history by definition. When we find ourselves living in the perpetual present, books become the furniture of eternity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James.